friends, welcome to the series which we are doing on issues in World History 1, the 20th century, and today we will talk about Japanese militarism. And as we know that how during the Second World War and before that the kind of situation which was there evident in the world, we find that some of the movements like Nazism, fascism, they rose after the First World War. And the interwar period is also a history which we find which deals with the ideas of Nazism and fascism. And when we tend to see the situation in Japan, then some of the scholars they have argued that it was Japanese militarism was also one of the forms of fascism, the way military was operating in Japan, and how the middle level officers they were involved in the decision making. So in the course of our discussion we will try to in a way see the situation in Japan, how this kind of a situation can be seen in the framework of fascism in that sense, because some of the scholars like Yoshimi Yoshiaki have argued that there was fascism in Japan and Japanese militarism could be understood in that framework, and the others, those who have rejected, and they have given there some kind of an assessment that how it was more of a military exercise which we see in Japan. So if we tend to understand the period from 1931 to 1941 and how the kind of decade which was preceding the outbreak of the Pacific War, and we see that how this is often referred to by the Japanese as Korai Janima, that is the Dark Valley. And this was also a period which saw the unprecedented rise of militarism and ultra-nationalism in Japan. So when we tend to understand Japanese history, when we tend to see it in the kind of a framework that how the kind of developments which are happening in Japan from the military point of view, and how the supremacy of military could be seen in politics, economy and other foreign relations. So in that context we find whether the Japanese military was fascist in nature or whether the kind of regime was fascist in nature. So in that sense, when you tend to understand both these systems, that how when you talk about fascism, so some kind of aggressive nationalism which is based on superiority of a stock of people, as we see in the case of Nazism, where we find that Germans they were seen to be of the Aryan race, and rest of the people they were not seen in the framework of being Aryans. This is how Germans they categorize themselves. And when you talk about the authoritarian political state, how it was highly regimented and a single leader was an important concern in fascism, and how this leader would dictate what was to be done. And on the other hand, when we tend to understand a military state, then how military plays a predominant role in the administration of the country, and how it is the formulator of the economic and political policies, the way politicians make the policies or they execute the various policies which have been made. Military has a lot of role in terms of decision making in the framework of these policies. And when we see the Japanese situation, we find that how aggressive and expansionist policy is pursued in the foreign relations as well, and this was also being done in the case of Japan. And when we see the fascist states, then we see how Benito Mussolini, who was in Italy, and Hitler, who was in Germany, they were the classic examples of the fascist state. So scholars they have seen in that sense that how Japan could be in a way equated with these countries. And when we tend to understand the situation in Japan, then we find that some of the fascist characteristics they were there, in the sense that how foreign relations they were very aggressive, and how they also considered superior in the context that how they, when Japanese they were fighting other nations, and once they become victorious, how they treated the citizens of Asia, those who were the part of other country. and they were also following some kind of repressive policy in relation to the dissent at home. So we find that these are some of the things which we see in the case of Japan. And but when we in a way tend to understand in the framework of the two European countries, Germany and Italy, then we will realize that Japan did not have any kind of a coup as it happened in Rome in 1922 or Hitler did in 1933. And we also find that there was no mass fascist party, as there was a Nazi party in Germany, and there was no one leader like Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany. So when we tend to see these were one of the most important characteristics of fascism in that sense, and they were absent in Japan. But here the military, which was pervasive, and it had a lot of decisive powers, and how the emperor continued to be the head of the state. So despite military taking the decisions, or the military rung which was middle in nature taking all those decisions, but we find that how emperor was the head of the state. And the situation changes after 1930, where we find that how the assertion of power was there in the military framework, and how it was also fighting for the restoration of the prestige of the emperor. And when we see that how Japanese society or Japanese state, how it was functioning, then we find that the state was governed by the military elements at that time. And we also see that the other sections of the society, like the bureaucracy, the agrarian class, militarist, Asian liberationist, National Socialist, all elder statesmen and scholars, all of them, they believed in the uniqueness of Japan in that sense. And the nationalist sentiments, they were also inculcated into the very consciousness of the Japanese people. So we find that how the idea of nationalist or nationalist sentiments, they were there in the consciousness of the Japanese people, and how the various sections of the society, they also had this kind of a belief in the uniqueness of Japan, how their society was different from the European society. And we also see that the kind of changes which came in the Japanese society, how it adopted the path of modernization along the western lines, and how it also retained some of the fundamental aspects of its society, like the monarchy, Confucian ethics, and the samurai tradition of service. So these kind of traditions, they were also part of the Japanese society. They did modernize on certain lines, but at the same time the traditional pattern of the Japanese society was also not bargained in that sense. It was also being maintained and preserved. And we see these kinds of changes which came in the 1930s in the context where we find that how 30s and the 40s, where we find some kind of an ultra nationalism, and how the military leaders, they felt that how they had to rescue Japan from the influence of political and business leaders, and how the prestige of the emperor was to be restored in that sense. And we also see that military leaders, they also had this kind of feeling that how the business leaders and politicians, they were in a way proving some kind of a danger or jeopardizing the Japanism of the society. So this kind of an idea, the uniqueness of Japan, the kind of values which were associated with the Japanese society, all of them, they were part of their thinking. And we also find that how when you talk about the Meiji period, when it started, and how military was in a way important in the framework of the state affairs and administration in the Meiji Restoration when it took place, and how also they were playing an important role in the decision making process of the government as well. And we also find that half of the total number of PMs, prime ministers, from 1885 to 1945 had been military leaders. So we find that how military leaders, they were also part of the civil administration, as we find that half of the PMs were during this particular period of nearly 60 years, they were the military leaders, they were the ones who were also deciding the affairs of the state in the framework of the civilian government as well. And we find apart from PM, other ministers, they in the framework of Home Minister, Foreign Minister as well, they were also many of the military leaders. And we find that how even the ministry in any case was always held by the top military leaders, even in a cabinet formed by the majority political party. And we see that when you talk about the constitution, Meiji constitution, which came in 1889, it provided for a parliamentary system in which the elected representatives in the Diet, they participated in the decision making. And we find that they did not play a dominant role because the emperor was invested with the extensive powers. And we find that all the executive organs which acted for the emperor could implement their plans without the approval of the Diet, which also had no control over the military. And when you see it in the framework of the various instances, we find that Article 11 stated the emperor is the supreme commander of the army and the navy. And according to the Article 12, the emperor determines the organization and peace standing of the army and navy. So we find that how emperor was the supreme commander of the defense forces, and how emperor was the important factor in terms of organizing and determining the peace standing of the army and navy. So in that sense, we find that this kind of importance which was being given to the emperor, and army also from 1930s onwards was talking in that framework that the will of the emperor was supreme, and they had to restore the prestige of the emperor because the prestige of the emperor was getting dwindled in some way. So we see that how emperor as the supreme commander was advised by army and the navy general staff, and we also find that they could formulate and execute plans which need not be approved by the government as well, and nor was it necessary for them to even inform the government about their decisions as well. So we find that the general staff was all powerful, and they were making and executing plans, and they were not seeking approval from the government as well, and it was not necessary for also in that sense to inform about their decisions. So that was the kind of a situation which we see in Japan, and it was also due to the fact that how Article 7, it is stated that in matters involving military secrecy and command reported by the chief of the general staff to the throne, except those matters on which the emperor himself informs the cabinet, the army and navy minister should report to the prime minister. So we find that how these kinds of articles, these kinds of laws in that sense, they were also responsible, where we find that some kind of prestige of the emperor became a concern. And when we see the situation in Japan, we find that how the defense portfolio remained with the military officer, and because of which the military could topple any government which was not acceptable to it by simply asking its officer to resign or refusing to nominate an officer for the post. And this tactic was used by military many a times, where they in a way did not nominate a member, and when such a member was not existent, so then they had this kind of situation where they toppled the government. So we find that how many a times military people, they had some kind of displeasure or dissonance with the political parties, and the genre or the elder statesmen had played a major role in the Meiji Restoration and in the modernization process of the country. So we find that how these genre, they had a special status in the society which was in a way superior to the government as well as the military, and how these people, they had in a way direct access to the emperor, and their views, which were often followed as well. So we find that these genre, when they were there, there were very less serious conflicts between the civilian and the military policies. But over a period of time, we find that these general members, they died or retired, and now the conflict between the political parties, which had become an important force in the politics and the military, they became more serious in that sense. And we see that how many times military was not happy with the kind of approach of the political parties, the way the political parties, they were functioning at that time, which had formed the government. And this was happening in from the end of the First World War. We find that in the initial period of 1920s, this kind of a situation could be seen in Japan. And we also see that how they were also objected to the attitude of the political parties, who resisted the increase in the military budget and expansion of its division. So political parties, they were also the political parties which did not wish to extend the army budget or expand the army divisions. Military was also not happy with it, and military was also unhappy with the China policy of the political parties. So we see that from in the framework of 1922 4th February bilateral agreement between Japan and China, it restored the sovereignty of Shantung province to China, and Japanese economic privilege in the region, they were being ratified. And from that time onwards, we find that how the China policy was aimed to mainly achieve the economic goals instead of the military expansion. And this was referred to as the soft China policy, which was not liked in that sense by the military establishment. They were critical of this policy, and they felt that the Japanese gains on the mainland were likely to be imperiled due to the upsurge of the anti-imperialist movement, which was gaining momentum under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of Kuomintang or KMT. And we find that how Chiang Kai-shek, he demanded a review of all foreign rights, including those of Japan, and questioned the continuation of Japan's dominant role in South Manchuria. And so in that sense, when we tend to understand the situation in Japan, that how on the various policy matters, political parties and military establishment, they were at loggerheads, and military establishment wanted some kind of a policy which was to be followed. On the other hand, the political parties, they had a different view in this context. And we also see that how political parties had close alliances with the business houses and Zaibatsu, and farmers in particular, they believed that the political party dominated government safeguarded the interests of the Zaibatsu and emphasized on trade and industry rather than agriculture. So from that point of view, farmers and agriculturalists, they also had their opinion, or they had their own biases with regard to how the political parties, they were having relations with the business class. And in that context, they were also in a way, they had some kind of a dissonance or dissatisfaction with the political parties, and they felt that something more should have been done with regard to the agriculturalists or the problems of the agriculturalist class. And when you tend to see when how the political parties and the business class, they were in a way seen hand in glove in the framework of spreading the corruption, and they also were thinking in the framework of how the foreign ideologies which were considered to be dangerous, and how they were detrimental to the authority of the emperor, and how these political parties, they were also supporting such kind of ideologies. And we find that military took advantage of all such feelings against the political parties, And we find that when we tend to understand this in the framework of this background, we find how the Navy strongly opposed the London Naval Treaty in 1930, which called for the armament reduction, but the then PM Hamaguchi Yuko got it ratified by the Diet, and because of which we find that the government was severely criticized, and there was also violent opposition in Tokyo. So, various kinds of treaties or international alliances at that point of time, they were also responsible for, in a way, increasing the distrust between the political parties and the military, and later we find Hamaguchi was also killed as well, he was assassinated, and the last PM Inukai Shushi was also not popular with the military, who did not find it necessary to keep the government informed about their military actions in Manchuria. And we find that these kinds of leaders, Inukai again, for example, he opposed the military expansion and called for discipline in the army. So, such kind of concerns they were there between the military officers or the military establishment and the political parties, and we find that later in that sense we find that how Inukai was also killed by a junior military officer in 1932, and we find that this also brought an end to the era of party government in Japan. So, we see that this kind of a distrust between the political parties and military establishment was one of the reasons in that sense for some kind of instability in the framework of the state, where we find that the military was able to take an advantage in the framework, that they were able to rally people for their support. And we find that how public opinion was also very important, and how the military establishment in the framework communicated that how they were fighting for the prestige of the emperor, which was being diminished by the political parties. So, when you tend to understand the Japanese society, when we tend to understand that how public opinion was an important concern when people or the government, for example, they were going for war, as it was happening in the case of Germany and Italy as well. So, with this I would like to end the discussion. We will continue in the about the Japanese militarism in our next lecture. Thank you very much.